Welcome to our second video in this module where you're going to be learning about nonverbal communication. In this video, you're going to be learning about the general principles of nonverbal communication and the elements of nonverbal communication. You'll also learn about how you can detect deception based on what the research has to say and the significance of nonverbal communication. So let's get started. Verbal communication is important in our ability to express our ideas, our emotions, our experiences, our thoughts, and people. But what function does nonverbal communication serve when we communicate? Even though it's not through words, nonverbal communication serves many functions to help us communicate meanings with one another more effectively. There are several general principles of nonverbal communication. First, nonverbal communication conveys emotions. So facial expressions and body posture can convey how we feel without words. Sometimes nonverbal communication is used to duplicate what we are already saying, and then it also may be used to replace what we're already saying. In the case of duplication, we usually use a nonverbal communication that's recognizable to most people within that cultural group that we're communicating with. So, for example, you might use a head nod or a head shake to duplicate the verbal message of yes or no. Nonverbal communication can also replace verbal communication. And so let's say that, if someone asks you a question, instead of a verbal reply, yes, yes, I agree, yes, I like this, you have you might simply choose to nod your head without that accompanying verbal message. It's also multi-channeled. So we use facial expressions, gestures, eye contact, vocal tone, and body language. And all of these go back to number one because they all have a way of expressing emotions. So some of the nonverbal communications that we express that might be expressing an emotion like, I agree with this, I feel a certain way, might be very, very straightforward and very clear. And then for other instances, they may not be. And so we might rely on, we might rely more on looking at someone's eye contact or their body language. In addition, body language and eye contact and gestures and facial expressions can all be ambiguous. And this means that it can be difficult for us to interpret. So we might, for example, assume that if someone does not make eye contact, we might assume, let's say, we assume one thing when in fact it may mean something else. In my classes that I've had on campus, when I ask students, what does a lack of eye contact mean? Some students will say that that means dishonesty or it means a lack of confidence, but it might not mean either of those things. There are some people, and actually many people, who may not make eye contact because they find that that is overstimulating in the conversation. It feels uncomfortable to look into another person's eyes directly throughout conversation. And so they might look the other way. Also, we have to think about culture. In some cultures, making direct eye contact, especially with someone who's in a position of authority, would be very disrespectful. Whereas in other cultures, like our own, it's seen as being an indicator of confidence and something you should be doing if you're interviewing with someone who's in a position of authority. So culture plays an important role here. And you can then imagine how ambiguity comes into play when we may have a difficult time accurately interpreting body language. And sometimes body language and vocal tone and gestures and eye contact may actually contradict verbal messages. So we might say one thing, but our body conveys something very different. And we'll look at that in particular when it comes to dishonesty. But there are other areas where there can be contradiction. And then again, just like I mentioned a moment ago with ambiguity, it is culture bound. So, the way that a person communicates nonverbally in one culture may be perceived as one way, but then take that person to another culture and it may be very inaccurately understood. So we have to think about culture when we're thinking about nonverbal communication. And we need to think about our own behavior and the way we're communicating nonverbally when we are communicating with people from other cultural backgrounds if we want our message to be accurately understood and interpreted. Research on personal space has a long history in psychology, and many research studies have resulted in the establishment that there's a zone of physical proximity that allows people to feel comfortable in the presence of other people. The study of personal space is known as proxemics. Your preference for the amount of personal space depends upon the nature of your relationship with the other person, social norms and culture, specific situations, social status, and a variety of other variables that we'll look at. Let's first consider the nature of the relationship. First, if you'll look at the diagram in your textbook that shows you the different types of personal space that range from personal or intimate, to personal to all the way to public, you'll see that there are different amounts of personal space that we're comfortable with depending upon the relationship that we have with another person. I think it's also important to note too that the nature of the relationship is also affected by the power differential between ourselves and another person. Typically, we will not impose on the personal space of a person that we feel is of higher status than ourselves. However, people who perceive themselves to be of higher status are more likely to impose on our personal space. So if they perceive that they're of higher status than we are, they are likely to impose on our personal space. And this doesn't only include stepping within our personal space, but it could even include things like, touching our arm, or maybe patting our shoulder. So there's definitely a difference in personal space and the appreciation for personal space when there is a power differential. The norms for personal space have developed over many thousands of years and have something to do with the norms for intimacy, for self-expression, and for privacy. And as you'll recall from our last discussion on individualism and collectivism, Americans are known for valuing their individualism and their autonomy, which translates into greater sensitivity to the violation of their private spaces. Oddly enough, everyone except the truly phobic will make an exception when there's no escaping the crowd, though. So, somehow our personal space craving senses are willing to balance the inner sense of discomfort against whatever maybe the situation is requiring of us. So we know that personal space not only varies by social norms and culture, it is affected by specific situations, and these interact with one another. So there's not necessarily a definition for the zones of personal space that we could ever say are universal, but we do see some cultural differences and norms. So I think it's interesting that, as culturally and situationally relative as they are, the zones of personal space maybe have a biological basis. And so there was a study that was conducted it was a case study on a woman who had suffered damage to her amygdala on both sides of her brain. So the amygdala is important for the fear response, and it lets us, when we sense danger, the amygdala becomes active. So she had damage to the amygdala, and first what they did is they asked her to indicate at what distance she felt comfortable with the distance between herself and the experimenter. And in each of the trials, and they did many trials, the woman said that she felt comfortable at any distance, including nose to nose. And the experimenters even put her in a situation when she didn't know she was being tested, as one of the male research assistants engaged her in conversation while standing far closer to her than would ever be considered socially acceptable. And even that wasn't too close for her personal comfort. So the participant she actually also underestimated by about half the distance that she thought would be uncomfortably close for others. So she wasn't only not affected by people imposing on her personal space and imposing very substantially, but she wasn't as aware of the personal space that other people felt comfortable with. And the big difference between her and others was the damage to her amygdala. So again, why would your amygdala care if someone's getting too close to you? So as I mentioned a moment ago, the amygdala is triggered when we're fearful, when we feel like we're being threatened or attacked. And in most situations, we can calm down the amygdala by engaging our prefrontal cortex that inhibits our emotional activation. But this activation can get out of control if our cortex doesn't do its job, or if that provocation becomes too severe or prolonged. So the cortex is clearly, in this situation, is enforcing the norms that we gain through exposure to society's beliefs about social closeness. And when someone crosses that normative line, all bets are off, and the amygdala tries to gain a sense of control. And again, just going back to the preference for the, the amount of personal space that we're comfortable with, and the list that I have listed here, social status, as I mentioned a moment ago, is important. The higher your social status, the more personal space you tend to control. Some additional factors that affect personal space and personal space perception are age and gender, personality, anxiety, abnormal behavior, and social perception. So the research suggests that males interacting with other males require the largest interpersonal distance, followed by females interacting with other females, and then finally males interacting with females. So it's also important to know that this does depend on the situation or the relationship or the age of the group too. Some evidence actually suggests too that personal space gets bigger as we grow older, and that children tend to be pretty happy to be physically close to one another. And this is something that changes as awareness of our sexuality develops after puberty. So in addition, the gender difference does tend to appear right around puberty as well. Something else that's related to personal space that some of you may have noticed too is cooperation versus competition. And so generally people who are in cooperation will select a smaller interpersonal distance unless the competition requires some interpersonal contact. And the general finding for status focuses on differences in status. And it seems that the greater the difference in status between people, as I mentioned before, the larger the interpersonal distance used. And the one who then imposes on that interpersonal space when there is a differential in status is going to be the person who is in a higher status position. I think also what's interesting too is that our anticipation of a type of person that we're going to meet in a situation influences our choice of interpersonal distance. So, if we're meeting or anticipate meeting a warm and friendly person, we might choose smaller distances. Also, we are less likely to offer help to someone if our personal space has been invaded. There are certainly many other variables that affect personal space, and I would encourage you, as you think about personal space, to think about your own experiences that you've had in the past. And then I would encourage you to think from this point on about the personal space that you experience in your own relationships and your interactions with people. And I think it's interesting to take time to reflect on the preferences that other people have, and to take note on the personal space that they prefer, and to really reflect on the type of relationship that they perceive exists between you and them. And here we see the 4 major categories of personal space or personal distances. And this was originally developed by a researcher by the last name of Hall. And one of your classmates asked me some time back if you needed to know the names of different researchers. And I'm not going to ask you to know the names of different researchers. I think if we're talking about people like Solomon Asch and Milgram and major ones like that, major theorists, it is helpful to know their names, and that will help you as you're responding to application-oriented questions on the test. But for the most part, I'm not actually, in any context, unless I let you know, I'm not going to ask you to tell me what study someone by the last name of Cialdini conducted in 1997. I would not ask you anything like that. But I do just want to give you the last name of the researcher to give them credit. So take a look at this diagram in your textbook. Another important element of nonverbal communication is that of facial expressions. Facial expressions convey a variety of emotions, including basic emotions that are recognized by people around the world. The concept of basic or primary emotions dates back at least to the Book of Rites, which was a first-century Chinese encyclopedia that identified 7 feelings of men that included joy, anger, sadness, fear, love, disliking, and liking. Fast forward to the 20th century, and Paul Ekman, who you'll see cited in your textbook, identified 6 basic emotions. These include anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. So take a moment and reflect. Ask yourself, why would we as human beings have the ability to detect these basic emotional expressions? Why would we as humans express them similarly around the world? So in other words, why would we be so easily able to recognize and convey anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise? When we think about why, it's said that these basic emotions may have come about in response to ecological changes and challenges that were faced by our ancestors, and that they are so primitive that they're hardwired with each of our, we're hardwired with these basic emotions that are corresponding to a distinct and dedicated neurological circuit. So being hardwired, these basic emotions that I just mentioned, they're innate and they're universal, they're automatic, they're fast, and they trigger behavior that has a very high survival value. So while we may be hardwired with these basic emotions, and you can see these illustrated in your textbook, there also is variation across cultures in how many other emotions are expressed. And in addition, there are many emotions that we are not so easily able to detect, regardless of our cultural familiarity with the individual. So think about emotions like embarrassment or nostalgia or envy. Those are not so easy to detect, but maybe it's because they didn't have such high survival value to our ancestors, and so we're not hardwired to express those emotions or detect them in these universal ways. So as you can see here on this slide, there are also cultural specific norms that govern how we express emotions, and these are called display rules. Display rules dictate the types and frequencies of emotional displays that are considered acceptable within a certain culture. These rules may also guide how people choose to regulate their emotions and ultimately influence an individual's emotional experience and lead to general cultural differences in the experience and the display of emotion. So for example, in many Asian cultures, social harmony is prioritized over individual gain, whereas Westerners in much of Europe and the United States prioritize individual self-promotion. So research has shown that individuals from the US are more likely to express negative emotions such as fear, anger, and disgust, both alone and in the presence of others, while Japanese individuals are more likely to do so only when alone. So think about then how this may be a reflection of those cultural differences. So individuals from cultures that tend to emphasize social cohesion are more likely to suppress their own emotional reaction as well, in order to perhaps first evaluate what response is most appropriate in the given situation. And so, this makes a tremendous amount of sense why, that you would see these differences. If you're in a culture that is promoting social cohesion, it's going to be very important for you to be very mindful in how you think about how you come across so that you can protect and maintain that social cohesion. I think it's also important to note too that cultures that differ in their social consequences they assign to different emotions, affect how emotions are expressed. So think about a culture where men may not be perceived positively or favorably for crying, and so we might not see as much crying among men within that given culture, whereas in another culture, you may see that anger is very negatively viewed. There's a Eskimo population, they're called the Utko Eskimos, and the expression of anger in their culture can actually result in social ostracism. So this then is going to affect how emotions are expressed and also how they're experienced. I also want to point out that there's some evidence that men and women may differ in the regulation of their own emotions, of different emotions, and this may be due to culturally based gender norms and expectations. This is an image in your textbook that is taken from an original study that was done by Paul Ekman and his fellow researchers, where they were looking at these universal emotions and the detection of these emotions. And you can see here they have the countries of the United States, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Japan, and New Guinea. And they're looking at how well are people interpreting the emotion being displayed, and is there a concordance rate? In other words, are they similarly detecting these emotions of fear, disgust, happiness, and anger, which are some of those basic emotions that we just looked at? And you can see that it looks like there is a little bit of variation. For example, with disgust, New Guinea the participants from New Guinea were not as high in their level of agreement in judging the photos, but you can see among all the other countries there was a very high rate of agreement. You see the same thing being true in anger. And in happiness, you see that all of the rates are at least above 80. So again, you see here that there is this universality, pretty much this universality of how well people are able to detect emotions. There is going to be variation. Some of that will be due to display rules. And I also want to mention too that the intensity of how emotions are expressed varies from culture to culture, which can affect how well people interpret these basic emotions. So, if you're living in a culture where, let's say, disgust is something that is not as intensely expressed, although with the same facial expression, no matter where you go, it's not as intensely expressed in one country, then it might be more difficult for people from within that country to detect a much more intense expression of it. Or and the same thing could be true with these other basic emotions.
Let's take a moment to reflect. What do you think? Do you think it's possible for people to exert conscious control over the facial expressions that are used to convey basic emotions? What kinds of people are likely to be particularly skillful at manipulating their facial expressions? Do you feel like you're very skillful at this? Well, it's no secret that some of us are more conscious of our facial expressions than others. Some of us are highly aware of ourselves. We have a high level of self-awareness, and we can hijack into this process of triggering a facial expression at an earlier stage. So, for example, a person with a high level of self-awareness may sometimes be able to change their interpretation of a situation as soon as it starts happening, thereby preventing the emotion and hence the facial expression. In other words, their consciousness is alert and sharp enough to penetrate the fast process of triggering the facial expression in order to short circuit the entire process. Do you feel like you have that ability? Do you think you could develop that ability? So naturally, some of these people that do this are often very good at controlling their emotions. This is not to say that the less conscious people, some of you who may be listening to this may feel like you're not as conscious, but that doesn't mean that you can't control your emotions or your facial expressions. People who have a relatively low level of awareness usually control their expressions once they've already made them, because it's at this time only that they become aware of their emotions and their facial expressions. But until then, the entire process of observation, interpretation, and generation of a reaction has already been carried out. So these types of interpretations are usually instantaneous, but some events may take longer to interpret, long enough to let us become conscious of the process and therefore interfere with it. So in these types of situations, the less conscious people get a chance to control their facial expressions before they make them.
Perhaps the most important element of nonverbal communication is eye contact. And perhaps more specifically, the duration of eye contact is the most meaningful aspect of this channel of nonverbal communication. Among European Americans, as you've read, high levels of eye contact are associated with effective social skills and credibility. And research studies on nonverbal behavior suggest that eye contact, and these more specifically the amount of eye contact that a person gives, affects whether a person perceives that individual as honest or dishonest. So while eye contact is perceived favorably among European Americans, eye contact is judged as offensive by other cultures. There's quite a bit of research on eye contact variations across cultures, and I certainly don't want to make generalizations as I share these with you because there are always individual variations within cultures. But what the research does suggest overall is that in many Asian cultures, avoiding eye contact can be seen as a sign of respect, and that in Latin and North America, eye contact can be considered important for conveying equality among individuals. In contrast, in Ghana, if a young child looks an adult in the eye, it's considered an act of defiance. Again, these are generalizations, and there is certainly individual variation within cultures. I think it's also important to note that eye contact can also be affected by the amount of stimulation a person is experiencing. For some people, making continued eye contact can be overwhelming. And so a person may avert their gaze, not because in our culture where we think of, making direct eye contact as showing honesty or social skills or confidence. And so not because they lack those things, but because they may be feeling overwhelmed by that experience. In addition, we might see among children and adults who have autism spectrum disorder, we might see less eye contact. So there are additional reasons why we would see some variations in eye contact. It is important to be aware of cultural differences, especially if you are traveling to another country, so that you can know what's considered acceptable, what's considered offensive, and what the meaning is behind making direct eye contact. And I think it's also important for us to keep in mind that there are a variety of reasons for differing levels of eye contact that a person might make, whether they be cultural, personality, power differential, or many other variables. So as your textbook points out, and this is based upon Western cultures, eye contact can convey the intensity of feelings, and in our culture, in a positive context, long gazes signal loving feelings, but in a negative context, long gazes are interpreted as stares and they make people uncomfortable. So think about when you've been out and someone has looked at you for too long, it can make you feel very uncomfortable and feel threatened. Eye contact is also, as I mentioned a moment ago, affected by status. It's also affected by race and gender. Please take a look at this diagram in your textbook so that you can gain a greater understanding of the gender differences in visual dominance behavior. Another important part of nonverbal communication is body language, and the study of communication through body movements is known as kinesics. As many of you know, posture can be an indicator of either a relaxed state or a state of defensiveness or tension. Many of you have noticed too that hand gestures can be important. So for example, a person may use hand gestures to emphasize the words that they speak. They may also point in a general direction that they share an affinity with. A person may, let's say, support the head with the hand by resting an elbow on the table, and this might indicate that the person is listening and is, holding the head steady in order to focus. And of course, if a person is supporting the head with both elbows on the table, this can convey boredom. And we might also look at, a person who is putting their hands in their pocket as perhaps being nervous or maybe even being deceptive. I think another interesting element of body language is mirroring. And so mirroring involves mimicking the other person's body language. And when you're interacting with someone, I think it would be useful to see if the person mirrors your behavior. So for example, if you're sitting at a table with someone and you rest an elbow on the table, see if the other person does the same in, in a few seconds or a minute or so. Another common mirroring gesture can involve taking a sip of a drink at the same time. And so if someone's mimicking your body language, this is a sign that they're trying to establish rapport with you. Now, this is not to suggest that they're doing this consciously. Sometimes we do this because we're very engaged with the individual. But I will tell you that through some articles that I've read in the past, and I remember when I was interviewing right out of college for my one of my first jobs, I remember reading that it was helpful to mirror the communication of the interviewer. Now, this is not to suggest that you should imitate exactly what they're doing, but if they're leaning forward, in a few seconds, leaning forward slightly as well can show that you are engaged and connected with that person. This is also important in counseling too, where you mirror the language of the person that you are doing counseling with. So I think that body language is a very interesting area of study. Certainly, this is an area of communication where we can gain a lot of information about what the other person is really communicating to us. Another element of nonverbal communication is touch. And touch can convey a variety of meanings, including meanings regarding about status and about power. And as many of you know, there are strong norms that govern where we touch our friends and who we touch. Female pairs touch more often than male pairs. And cross-gender touch is interpreted as support by females, but as power or sexual interest by males. So touch is another interesting element of nonverbal communication.
So take a moment to reflect. Do you tend to touch other people during conversations with them? What kinds of reactions does this behavior tend to elicit? I wonder, do you think that touch is an important part of communication for you? So there's a lot of research that supports that touch is very fundamental to each of us as humans. And that even though when we are young, when we're infants and toddlers, we are held and there's much more touch than there is in adulthood, the need does not change as we age. But oftentimes, as we move into adulthood, we may think of most touching in a sexual context. And some research suggests that this may actually leave us devoid of a very basic human need. There was an interesting book that was written many years ago, many years before many of you were born, and it was called The Human Significance of the Skin. And it was written by an author named Ashley Montague. And she said that a human being can't survive without the physical and behavioral functions that are performed by the skin. And here's a quote of hers. She says, "Among all the senses, touch stands paramount and is the mother of all senses. It's been shown to help our bodies maintain their defenses, to decrease anxiety and depression, hyperactivity, inattention, stress hormones, and cortisol levels." So what do you think? Do you think that as we in our culture seem to be pretty touch averse, especially relative to other very collectivistic cultures, do you think there can be some negative consequences of not having touch, or as much as perhaps we would see in other cultures? And what about with coronavirus and we have social distancing, and because of this we're having less touch? What do you think the psychological implications of this is? So think about yourselves. For some of you, you may communicate very much so through touch. For others, you may communicate in other ways. There's a great book, it's called Love Languages, and or the 5 Love Languages, and I'd encourage you to take a look at that book as well. And one way that some people communicate love, and that doesn't have to be love with a romantic partner, it could just be love with someone that you care about, like a sibling, a parent, a friend, a child. One way is through touch. And so what about people who haven't been able to use that way of communicating in the way that they have been able to for all of their lives? So we are wired, even if it's not your preference, we are wired and some of us more so than others, it seems, have this preference, but to connect with other people on that basic physical level. And actually, I will say that when you do receive touch from another person, it could be, seeing your grandmother and she puts her hand in your hand, or, seeing a friend that you haven't seen in a while and they give you a hug, that this actually releases a hormone called oxytocin, and this is a bonding hormone. And that this can have an effect on our connection with others, and actually touch, in addition, touch like that feeling from your grandmother or from a friend or from whomever that you care about, it can instantaneously increase our mood and actually can have a positive effect on our immune system and can reduce stress. So I think it is important for us, especially at this time, to think about what are the consequences now for each of us now that we don't have that same opportunity that we used to. And then especially for people who tend to communicate in that way, what has that consequence been for them?
Paralinguistics is the study of vocal cues that people use to communicate meaning. And paralanguage is the ever-present co-occurrent voice modifications or alternating independent sounds that accompany the words that we are using. This might include things like the use of higher pitched words, or breathy intonations, or sighing. It could include the use of silence, hesitations or pauses, the rate of speech, inflections, and expressiveness. As you know, when we're communicating via text, much of this can get lost. And so this paralanguage that we so often rely on and take for granted isn't present, and therefore a significant aspect of communication is missing and the message may not be accurately received. Research suggests that paralanguage is culture specific, and that you may see, for example, in certain cultures you might see more rhythmic styles in cultural interactions. In some cultures you might see more frequent pauses, more frequent hesitations. You may see more silences. So this does vary by culture. So if we're talking with a friend from a different culture, I think that's important to note that this varies cross-culturally. And then too, if you're working in the helping professions and you're working with a client from a different cultural background, it's important to note that there is cross-cultural variation, and we don't want to impose our own thoughts about what each of these things mean, like silence, hesitation, pause, sighing, when it may mean something very different because of a different cultural background. A recent meta-analysis, and if you'll remember, a meta-analysis is a study where researchers have analyzed many studies. And this was a meta-analysis of 253 studies of people who were distinguishing truths from lies, revealed an overall accuracy rate of just 53%, which, as you know, is not much better than flipping a coin. So nonverbal cues that actually indicate deception are often different from those that most people believe indicate deception. So, for example, liars often say less, not more. People who lie are not necessarily good storytellers, and they include less unusual content in stories. In addition, people who are lying are more tense and make a more negative impression on the listener. These are just a few of the things you can look for to detect deception. If you'll remember, when we were talking about facial expressions, you'll remember I mentioned a researcher who's very well known in the study of emotion, and his name is Paul Ekman. And Paul Ekman has extensive experience in training law enforcement experts in detecting deception. And he also has taught analytical interviewing and taught interviewing skills to everyone from airport security guards to counterterrorism agents to foreign service officers and police interrogators and people in the CIA and the FBI. And it really has come down to this training that results in people having a much better ability to detect deception. We think we are good at detecting deception, but getting training really allows for people to be much, much more effective at detecting deception, which only makes sense. We'll talk in a moment about the polygraph test, but before we do, I'd like to share with you just a few more things that you might look for to know if someone is being dishonest. So research suggests that people who are being dishonest take longer to start answering questions than those people who are telling the truth. But it is important to note that if they have time to plan, people who are lying actually start their answers more quickly than people who are telling the truth. And they also, as I mentioned a moment ago, talk less. Liars, like I mentioned just a moment ago, seem more negative, more nervous. They might be complaining more and they might be less cooperative. And I think it's also important to note that when people are being dishonest, they seem to withhold information, and maybe this is from guilt, or it might even be to make it easier to get their story straight. I think it's important to note too that there is fewer first-person pronouns. So this means that people who are lying avoid statements of ownership. They're distancing themselves from their stories, and they avoid taking responsibility for their behavior. I have a video clip on our course website that I would really encourage you to watch about detecting deception. It's a TED Talk. And you'll see that this is one of the things that they share, that when people are being dishonest, that they will distance themselves from their stories. If you go back to Bill Clinton, when he was being accused of having a relationship with Monica Lewinsky, he said, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." And so that's an example of distancing oneself from whatever they're being dishonest about. They also are more inclined to use more negative emotion words like hate and worthless or sad. And they may be more anxious too. Another interesting area of lie detection is, or way to detect dishonesty, is through microexpressions. And microexpressions last less than 1/5 of a second, and they might leak emotions that someone wants to conceal, like anger or guilt. Now, at the same time, signs of emotion aren't necessarily signs of guilt, and an innocent person may be apprehensive and appear guilty. But these can be very interesting indicators of what a person is really experiencing. I would encourage you to do a YouTube search for micro expressions. And I think when you do, you'll see a lot of very interesting examples of these. These are not things that we can typically detect consciously, or like, if we're just observing someone communicate. What really allows for the detection of these micro expressions is through videotaped interviews, where you can go back and play the recording frame by frame, and that's when you can see these very subtle expressions that perhaps are indicators of that the person is being dishonest. And so an indicator might be, I've seen videos of, a woman who had been accused of killing her husband, and she was in complete denial, reporting, telling the police she never did it. And in her interviews, she generally appeared fairly innocent. But when you looked at her frame by frame, you would see these micro expressions of intense anger. And that was, very much in conflict with the sadness that she was pretending to show in these interviews. One method that some people have used to detect deception is the polygraph. And most psychologists agree that there is little evidence that the polygraph test can accurately detect lies. Now, as you've probably noticed, lie detector tests have really become a popular cultural icon, where we see them in crime dramas and even in advertisements. And this picture of the polygraph pen that's wildly gyrating on a moving chart, like what you may have seen in Meet the Parents or Meet the Fockers, that's a readily recognized symbol. But this idea that we can detect a person's veracity by monitoring psychophysiological changes seems to be more of a myth than a reality. And even the term lie detector that's used to refer to polygraph testing is a misnomer. So, lie detection, this word or this phrase, it involves inferring deception through the analysis of as many of you know, physiological responses to a structured but unstandardized series of questions. So they're monitoring autonomic arousal like heart rate, blood pressure, respiration rate, perspiration, galvanic skin conductance. And it's a specific process that where there's an examination, it's typical examination that includes a pre-test phase where the technique is explained and each test question is reviewed. And then there's the pre-test interview where to ensure that the person who's being interviewed understands the questions and to induce a subject's concern about being deceptive. And then polygraph examinations will often include a procedure that's called a stimulation test, where there's a demonstration of the instrument's accuracy in detecting deception. There are many different questioning techniques that are commonly used in polygraph tests, and probably the most widely used one is what's called a control question test. And this is what is most frequently used when there's a criminal investigation. And this is where the control question test compares responses to relevant questions, like did you shoot your wife, with those of control questions. And the control questions are designed to control the effect of the generally threatening nature of relevant questions. Control questions, concern the misdeeds that are similar to those being investigated, but they might refer to the subject's past, and they're usually broad in scope. So like, have you ever betrayed someone who has trusted you? So a person who is telling the truth, it's assumed that, that they'll fear control questions more than relevant ones. And this is because the control questions are designed to really arouse a subject's concern about their past truthfulness. Like, have you betrayed anyone who's trusted you? And the relevant questions ask about a crime that, if they're innocent, they did not commit. And so a pattern of greater physiological responses to relevant questions than control questions leads to a diagnosis of deception. There are other ways to administer polygraph tests, but it's important to note that there are some problems with polygraph tests. And so, sometimes people may, try to beat examinations, like use countermeasures, and these may be effective. So this might include, simple movements, some sort of psychological intervention, like manipulating their own beliefs about the test, or even using some pharmacological agent. And so, so there's that problem. There are other issues revolving around polygraph tests as well. And so the validity of polygraph testing is questionable, and there are high error rates. And so the U.S. Supreme Court and other courts have so they've repeatedly rejected the use of polygraph evidence because of its inherent unreliability. But the problem is that polygraph testing continues to be used in non-judicial settings. So it's often used to screen personnel. It might be used to assess the veracity of suspects and witnesses, and to monitor criminal offenders on probation. So this is a problem because it may not be reliable, but it is still used in different settings. If polygraph tests aren't very effective at detecting dishonesty, then what about the brain? Would you be willing to go into an MRI if someone asked you to, if they wanted to know whether or not you were telling the truth? Well, brain imaging studies have contributed to the view that lying generally requires more effort than telling the truth, and it involves the prefrontal cortex. So in a study that was done in 2001 at the University of Sheffield in England, researchers tested the idea using a rather rudimentary experimental setup. And so what participants were asked to do was to lay in a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, that's an fMRI. And they were asked to answer questions about their daily routine by pressing a yes or a no button on a screen. So depending on the color of the writing, they were to either answer truthfully or with a lie. Now, the researchers, of course, knew the correct answers from earlier interviews. Interestingly, the results showed that participants needed a lot more time to formulate a dishonest answer than an honest one. And in addition, certain parts of the prefrontal cortex were more active during lying. So in other words, what they saw was that those areas of the prefrontal cortex that they were looking at had more blood flowing in them. So together, these findings indicate that the executive part of the brain was doing more processing during lying. In another interesting example showing evidence for the role of the brain in dishonesty and honesty was that of a 51-year-old man who we might call Mr. Pinocchio. And he had a very unusual problem. When he tried to tell a lie, he often passed out and had convulsions. In essence, he became kind of a Pinocchio, you know, the functional puppet whose nose grew with every fib that we learned about when we were children. So for this particular patient, the consequences were all too real. He was actually a high-ranking official in the European Economic Community, and this was since replaced by the EU. So that's what, just in case you're familiar with that, that's what it was called at the, prior to it being called the EU. And his negotiating partners, interestingly, and maybe perhaps comically, but not so comically, could tell they could tell immediately when he was bending the truth, of course. And his condition, which was a symptom of a rare form of epilepsy, was not only dangerous, but as you could imagine, it was not good for his career. So his doctors discovered that the root of his problem was a tumor that was about the size of a walnut, and it was probably increasing the excitability of a brain region that's involved in emotions. This part of the brain involved in emotions that was affected is called the amygdala. And so this was then triggering seizures. Once the tumor was removed, his seizures stopped and he was able to resume work. And the doctors who first described this case almost 30 years ago in 1993, they called this condition Pinocchio syndrome. And so this example, this case study demonstrates the far-reaching consequences of even minor changes in the structures of the brain. But it also shows us that lying has a major component of the brain, of the human's brain behavioral repertoire. And without it, we would have a hard time coping. So when people speak this unvarnished truth all the time, it can happen when Parkinson's disease or other injuries to the frontal lobe disrupt a person's ability to lie. They might tend to be tactless or hurtful. And as you all know, many of us, we might tell little white lies all the time, like your pie is awesome, or no, you haven't gained weight. And a little bit of this pretense seems to smooth out human relationships without doing lasting harm. But what if you didn't have this ability? How would this affect relationships? So perhaps that's why our brain is wired in this way. It may be that in human history, it has been somewhat adaptive to be a little bit dishonest, in those times where it might negatively affect a relationship when we are really honest about someone's hair or someone's weight or something that they've cooked us. But in general, of course, we know the traumatic effects that dishonesty can have on a relationship and on communication. So if you'll take a look at your textbook, you'll see a figure where you'll see the different nonverbal cues and indicators of deception. And I would encourage you to take a look at this in your textbook. So how good are you at accurately expressing and understanding nonverbal cues? I'm going to post a link to the nonverbal sensitivity test. And I would encourage you to take this test to assess your own abilities. I'll be posting this along with the other resources for this chapter. It turns out that women tend to be better encoders and decoders. The question is this biological? Is this because of motivation? Is this because of learning? So this is something for you to reflect on. Think about the early experiences that women have in childhood, what they're encouraged to play with, what activities they might be more likely to engage in. Are they engaging in more play activities that encourage communication than boys? Or is that not your experience? I think that, we all have had different experiences, but I do wonder what early experiences, what role they may play in shaping this difference. Keep in mind, this is a general difference. There are certainly going to be men who are better encoders and decoders than some women. And it's important to note that anyone can improve their nonverbal skills.
So what have you learned? Well, you learned about the general principles of nonverbal communication and the elements of nonverbal communication. You also learned about detecting deception and the significance of nonverbal communication. What will you be learning about next? Well, you're going to learn about how you can increase your own communication skills. You'll also learn about self-disclosure and effective listening.